Good afternoon. Welcome to the latest installment of the Johns Hopkins Congressional Briefing. This series allows policymakers, their staff, and members of the public to gain up-to-the-minute insights and analysis from Johns Hopkins experts on topics of national importance. In 2020, there were more than 45,000 people who died by gunfire. Nearly 20,000 of these were homicides. Firearm homicide rates surged nearly 30% from 2019 to 2020. This is the largest one-year increase in a century. Preliminary data for 2021 suggests that gun violence is continuing to increase. Americans are traumatized, they're frustrated by this surge in violence, and they want solutions. In today's briefing, we'll be discussing effective policies and how to respond to new challenges in our efforts to prevent gun violence. I'm Daniel Webster, Bloomberg Professor of American Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm also director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Prevention and Policy. Our center was established as the first academic center to focus on this issue. Before I introduce my panelists, I want to remind you that we'll be providing answers to your questions in real time. So please submit your questions for our experts in the box at the bottom of your screen. For today's briefing, I'm joined by three of my colleagues. First, Dr. Cassandra Crofasi is an assistant professor of health policy and management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She also serves as deputy director of our Center for Gun Violence Prevention and Policy. She's published widely on the effects of state gun policies, the underground gun market, safe gun storage, and public opinions about gun laws. Cass will discuss the need to strengthen background checks with handgun purchaser licensing. We're also joined by Dr. Alex McCourt. He's an assistant scientist in health policy and management at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and also serves as director of legal research for our center. He's published on the effects of gun laws, governing efforts to keep guns to protect victims of intimate partner violence. And he will explain how privately made firearms, also referred to as ghost guns, are a growing threat to public safety, and what are the policy options to address this problem. And last but certainly not least is Eric Cumberbatch. He's a Bloomberg Fellow at our School of Public Health. He currently serves as Deputy Director of the New York City Mayor's Office for Criminal Justice. Excuse me. Few major cities have done as much to address community gun violence as New York City. Under Eric's leadership, he's helped shape and guide these initiatives. In addition to reducing violence, also address the trauma that communities impacted by gun violence face. Eric will share key lessons from his work that are particularly relevant to provisions in the Build Back Better legislation that would provide $5 billion for localities for community violence prevention. Now I'm going to turn to each of our speakers just for a brief overview of the issues that they're going to cover. And I'll start with Cass. Cass, could you explain to us opportunities to strengthen background check laws with licensing of purchasers and what that would mean?
Certainly. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks for having me here today. So I'm going to cover three main topics. So how purchaser licensing laws address weaknesses in federal law, how effective they are, at addressing multiple forms of violence and what our public opinion polling data says about support for these laws. But before I start, I want to be really clear that these laws are not an alternative to comprehensive background check laws. Rather, requiring prospective purchasers to get a license serves as a system to strengthen the quality of background checks and increase accountability. So there are three main ways that we see purchaser licensing laws address weaknesses in the current background check system. First, these laws require that prospective purchasers apply to state or local law enforcement for a license prior to buying a gun, before they walk into a gun shop. Think about the analogy of buying a car. When you go to a car dealership, the dealer doesn't assess whether you can lawfully drive. You do that first by going to the DMV or Department of Licensing. There, you verify your identity and pass a test to get your license, and then you go buy a car. Second, in contrast to background checks conducted by federally licensed firearm dealers, background checks for a purchase license utilize state and local records that might not yet have been reported into NICS, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. We know that there can be delays in reporting. Additionally, background checks for purchaser licensing often are facilitated by fingerprints, which can reduce the likelihood that a prohibiting condition is missed. In fact, most occupational licensure requires fingerprint-based background checks to make sure we're not missing prohibiting conditions. Third, federal law requires that background checks be completed within 3 days. If not, the default is that the sale can proceed, and around 5,000 default proceed sales occur each year, possibly more as a result of high sales from the COVID-19 pandemic. This means around 5,000 prohibited individuals are buying guns from licensed dealers each year because a background check wasn't completed within 3 days. In contrast, a purchaser licensing law provides, on average, up to 30 days for law enforcement to complete a more thorough background check for the license. And in states that have these laws in place, sellers, both licensed and private, can only transfer a gun to someone with a valid license, which can increase accountability. Importantly, we have several studies documenting the effectiveness of purchaser licensing laws at reducing crime and violence. First, these laws are associated with reductions in the diversion of guns for use in crime. For example, after Maryland implemented its law, crime gun recoveries in Baltimore City that originated from Maryland sales with strong indicators of diversion dropped by 75%. And a survey of criminal justice system involved men in Baltimore City found that our law made it harder to get a gun because fewer people were willing to engage in a straw purchase, and guns were more expensive because you had to get a license. We also know that purchaser licensing laws are associated with lower rates of firearm homicide. After implementing its law, Connecticut experienced a 28% decline in firearm homicide. Conversely, when Missouri repealed its law, firearm homicide increased by as much as 47%. We also have done research looking at purchaser licensing laws that require an in-person application and fingerprinting, and found they were associated with a 56% reduction in the incidence of fatal mass shootings. We also have research that these laws are associated with lower rates of firearm suicide. Again, looking at Connecticut and Missouri. Connecticut's law passage is associated with a 33% reduction in firearm suicide, and Missouri's repeal is associated with a 24% increase. This may be due in part to better identification and screening of high-risk individuals, and it also could be due to the delay of impulsive acquisition of firearms. The last piece I want to say about the effectiveness of these laws is that we also find them to be associated with fewer law enforcement officers shot in the line of duty. And some of our new work that's currently under review finds lower rates of officer-involved shootings in states with purchaser licensing laws. So the third main point that I wanted to cover is to highlight In addition to being an effective policy, there's broad public support for purchaser licensing as well. According to our national public opinion polling, more than 70% of US adults, including 60% of gun owners, support requiring prospective purchasers to get a license before buying a gun. And if you look at support for purchaser licensing in states where these laws are already in place, support among gun owners increases from 60% to 77%. Handgun purchaser licensing laws are an effective way to strengthen our background check system to reduce gun deaths, and they also have broad public support. Thanks for this time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Cass. I'm going to turn to Alex now, but first I just want to remind our audience that they can put their questions in the chat window. So Alex, tell us, what do we know about the growing threat of ghost guns, and what are some of the policy solutions that we can apply to this problem?
Thank you so much, Daniel. I'm really happy to be here and get to talk about this really fascinating issue. Ghost guns are increasingly in the news. If you hadn't heard about them before this year, President Biden thrust them into the spotlight when he announced a set of federal actions aimed at reducing gun violence earlier this year. One of the first ones he announced was a directive to the ATF to issue a proposed rule seeking to deal with these guns. And I think this was one of the first times that a lot of people that aren't involved in this research or this policy had heard about these guns. Since then, we've seen really extensive press coverage, congressional hearings, local law enforcement reports, and policy debates. The ATF issued their proposed rule in the spring, seeking to regulate ghost guns, and they received a slew of public comments that I think they're still sifting through and hoping to release a finalized rule, if that's what they decide to do, pretty soon, maybe perhaps in early 2022. But to understand all this policy debate and what the ATF rule might do and what options there still are, I think there are three things that we need to understand. We need to understand what ghost guns are, what research evidence tells us about the relationship between these guns and violence, and finally, what we can do about it. So first, let's talk about what ghost guns are. Ghost guns are also called privately made firearms, and I think this is actually probably a better term. You can see in this image here that these guns are largely indistinguishable from traditionally made guns. So these are 4 guns that have been recovered by law enforcement agencies in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and also Capitol Police. The lower left image is a traditionally manufactured firearm. It has a serial number. It has other markings that allow us to identify it, allow law enforcement to identify it and maybe trace it. The other 3 guns are ghost guns. These are privately made firearms, likely made from kits. Now, these kits are, you can make a ghost gun from these kits or from 3D printed parts. And the 3D printed parts and the code and also the kits can be acquired without a background check. From these parts, you can construct a gun that, again, is virtually indistinguishable from a traditional gun. They are just as lethal and can be used in just the same manner. However, when they're recovered by law enforcement, they cannot be easily traced. A traditional gun, like the one in the lower left, is required to have markings that help law enforcement identify the source of the gun and perhaps trace the path of that gun all the way to the act of violence they are investigating. So maybe they can figure out who the manufacturer is. The manufacturer has records that allow them to see which licensed dealer the gun was sold to. The dealer may have records that show who they sold the gun to, etc. However, if a gun lacks these markings, they're much more difficult to trace. The ATF reported in its proposed rule that between 2016 and the beginning of 2021, they made almost 24,000 attempts to trace privately made firearms recovered by law enforcement, and they were successfully able to trace just 0.6% of those guns, or 151 guns. So these are very difficult to trace. So what role do these play in gun violence? You know, now that we understand that they can be purchased without a background check and they're difficult to trace, are they actually used in gun violence? And what does research tell us about these guns? Unfortunately, not very much yet. The ATF and law enforcement agencies have reported major increases in the number of privately made firearms recovered by law enforcement, suggesting that the prevalence of these guns is increasing. But we don't know much context. We don't know who possessed the gun, where it was recovered, the violent crime context, the crime that was at issue, and how these uses relate to the use of traditional guns or traditionally manufactured guns. What we do know, however, is the threat they pose to evidence-based gun policy. You just heard from Dr. Crofasi about the benefits of purchaser licensing and permit to purchase policies. These are associated with reductions in almost every type of gun violence. These policies rely upon screening for individuals that are high risk of harming themselves or others, and at least temporarily preventing them from purchasing or possessing guns. Ghost guns undermine that because these individual parts and kits can be purchased without a background check. People who are high risk and legally prohibited from possessing guns may be able to acquire these parts and kits to make their own gun without a background check and without any type of regulation. We've seen some of this already, and not just among adults. We've actually seen a slew of high-profile cases involving children. Just this week, there was a case where a 13-year-old boy was building and selling these ghost guns and accidentally shot his sister. These guns are available online. You could order them online and are largely unregulated. So what can we do about it? Well, I think first and foremost, data and education are key. As I said, we don't have a lot of research evidence and we don't have a lot of data, so it's difficult to know how these guns are sold and used and recovered. So the more data that we have and the more we're able to educate the public and policymakers and advocates, the better. But government can also enact policy solutions. The Biden administration has already directed the ATF to issue a rule that clarifies the definition of firearm to include most of these kits. The result of this rule, if it's finalized, would be that a lot of kits that are sold online and otherwise would require serial numbers. They would have to be serialized. You would have to undergo a background check to purchase them. And perhaps they would only be able to be initially sold by federally licensed firearm dealers. As a result, this would really limit the number of ghost guns. It would make it more difficult to get an untraceable ghost gun without a background check. However, there's still a lot more to be done. This rule does not address 3D printed guns. These are a kind of a growing threat. These guns are becoming more and more effective and lethal. The next step really should be to try to create a more flexible and anticipatory policy, because what we're learning from these guns and the proliferation of these guns is that technology is outpacing policy. The technology to fill these gaps in gun regulation is moving at a much faster pace than policy has. Some states have tried to fill the gap by requiring serial numbers for all guns, even if they're homemade, requiring background checks for the kits, or in some cases for some elements of 3D printed guns, and in some cases just banning homemade guns entirely. I think the most important policy solution here is to really understand the problem, and that means collecting and publishing transparent data. Now, I know that was a lot of information very quickly, so if you have questions, please let us know, and if we don't get to them, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex. So obviously, laws and policies are part of what we need to do to address gun violence, but we also need effective community solutions. So we're going to bring Eric Cumberbatch in now. And Eric, you've been working in this area now for decades. What can you share with us about what you are learning about the most effective community violence intervention approaches? And what are the key issues and challenges that we face when a city tries to do what you in New York have done, which is really make community violence intervention part of an overall public safety strategy, as opposed to, a few demonstration projects in a few neighborhoods?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and contribute. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to briefly discuss New York City's Office of Neighborhood Safety work and some of our key programs. For background, the Office of Neighborhood Safety is housed within the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, not because we believe that criminal justice offices have served or properly served Black or brown communities, but we're infusing public safety efforts into a space that has been very prescriptive and very paternalistic in most vulnerable community. So this is a crucial component of what we see as a public safety continuum, and it's a necessary part of the city's effort to co-produce public safety with local communities. The Office of Neighborhood Safety combines efforts from the Mayor's Action Plan for Neighborhood Safety, the Office to Prevent Gun Violence, and Atlas. We share resources and offer holistic assistance to New Yorkers that are affected by violence. The Office of Neighborhood Safety teams work with networks of residents and community leaders to ensure more New Yorkers have the agency and ability to define for themselves what public safety means, and rely on the residents, the actual people in community, their experience and expertise as guiding principles. And we're committed to ensuring that historically disenfranchised communities have access to opportunity. We foster deep relationships within vulnerable and historically disinvested communities in New York. We provide access to resources and other opportunities to help communities thrive. Our programs, we develop tools, we revitalize public spaces, and look for ways that we can minimize or eliminate the need to interact with the criminal justice system as a whole. Office of Neighborhood Safety, our key component programs are interdependent on one another. We rely on the expertise and innovation of effective programming across all of the different program aspects. And we believe that we're making a significant difference in the lives of New Yorkers, because we don't just have New Yorkers at the seat or in a seat at the table, but we've actually created a table which solutions, recommendations, implementation, and research happens from the community, by the community. Specifically, the Office to Prevent Gun Violence works to address gun violence through a shift in social norms and the work of community members in mediating disputes before shootings occur. We have a robust system that we refer to as a crisis management system, which deploys teams of credible messengers, community members whose life experiences allows them to connect with and motivate individuals with risk factors in their lives. They mediate conflicts on the ground. They connect individuals, vulnerable individuals, to crucial social services that can create peace and support healing. These include things that we do like barrier-free year-round employment programs, where our outreach workers are meeting and engaging with some of the highest risk individuals for being involved in gun violence and linking them to supportive employment programming, non-clinical mental health services, trauma counseling, and other opportunity-centered resources. Our public health-based gun violence prevention work is currently operating in 30 neighborhoods, which account for upwards of 60% of New York City's gun violence. And these community-led efforts have brought measurable benefits to New York City at large. Research has found that across our crisis management system sites in the neighborhoods where we're implementing programs, shooting incidents fell slightly under 30% over the first 24 months after launching programming. And gun victimization injuries are down over 30%. So, you know, we look at public safety going beyond enforcement, beyond incarceration and prosecution, really empowering community members to be part of the change that we all want to see at the community level. So thank you all, and I look forward to the discussion, and I'm willing to dive deeper in any capacity I can.
Thanks so much, Eric. Thanks also for the great work you're doing in New York. So we have some questions. I'm going to start with two that are pretty broad kind of questions, and then some that are a little more specific. So let's start with the big picture kind of questions. Something that came in prior to our briefing was, what's the most important step that can be taken to reduce gun violence? And I think what maybe the best way to respond to this is sort of put into two categories. What's the most effective policy or law response? And then at community level, what's the most important step? So I'm going to turn to Cassandra Crofasi now and get your insights on the most important step on the policy front.
Sure. First, I just want to start off by recognizing that this is a multifaceted issue and no one thing is going to solve the problem. We need to focus on supply, where the guns are coming from, how they're being sold, to whom they're being sold. We also need to focus on demand, why people feel the need to carry guns for protection, et cetera. So putting all of that aside for a moment, recognizing that this is a very complex issue, I think on the policy side, I really see two policies as being complementary and important. So purchaser licensing laws or permit to purchase laws that I talked about, really ensuring that we are screening out individuals who are too risky to own firearms, having a robust process at the point of acquisition to make sure people who are too dangerous to own guns aren't buying them in the first place. But then there are going to be people who lawfully acquire firearms who, for one reason or another, may become too risky to own them, at least temporarily. And having a complement of extreme risk protection orders where you can separate, at least temporarily, someone from their firearms and prevent them from acquiring more for the duration of the order, while that high risk period is there, is a really important way to make sure that we don't have people in possession of guns who are currently too risky to have.
Thank you. Eric, you want to share your thought, like what's the first important step? Again, you've been doing this for a long time, but let's say a city is just now made a commitment that they are going to really go big, so to speak, and have community violence intervention as a integral part of public safety. What's the first step?
Yeah, I think, in looking at it from the community lens, we're probably talking about, in most cities, the same neighborhoods that bear the burden for many or several adverse occurrences, whether it's poor schools, poor healthcare, redlining. All of these things have adversely impacted communities. Very intentional blight, lack of funding, lack of resources. So communities have been built in such a way that gun violence remains pervasive and individuals are extremely vulnerable. So how cities use their budgets is critical and key on, are we building an infrastructure to support a community that is not vulnerable to gun violence? The other piece is on the more individual level. I would say identity is a big issue. How young men in particular see themselves and what they believe is the expectation around behaviors. That's a key component as well. And the last thing I would say is access to actually mobility, economic mobility. Do I actually have a chance to thrive and not just survive in a space?
Thanks, Eric. I'm really glad you underscored this importance of building infrastructure. I think that is, nationally, certainly one of our key challenges and opportunities. And it again sort of connects back to potential legislation from Build Back Better and major investments to build up that infrastructure. Now to get to some little more specific questions. One question asked, how statistically strong are the studies on the effects of gun licensing, gun purchaser licensing? And the other note on here sort of suggest maybe the estimates are too large or maybe not believable when we think about mass shootings and suicides. Since I was a lead author on the mass shooting paper, I think I'll start with that and then maybe turn to Alex about the question on suicide. So in the mass shooting study that we did, yes, the estimate was rather large, a little over 50% lower rate of fatal mass shootings. As is always the case, there is a confidence interval around the point estimate. So it's quite possible that the sort of true effect is somewhat lower than 50%. But I think the effect still is quite large. One thing I'll just underscore about this is that in the study that we examined, we had decades of data. And so what I think, and this will, I think, also be relevant when we think about suicide, is these are policies that when they're in place for years and years and years, you have fewer and fewer guns in risky places. And the general availability of guns is so critical for many of these incidents of gun violence. So I think that's a sort of a key piece to understand. It's not as if you put in a licensing law and immediately mass shootings go down or suicides go down. This is something that occurs over years and sometimes decades. Alex.
Yeah, I think for suicide, we, largely the same thing that you just described, Daniel. But I think another important thing to keep in mind when we're looking at these studies is we're talking, especially when we're talking about suicide and purchaser licensing and gun licensing, we've actually seen many studies that have found similar results. So even if there was one study that you thought, well, this modeling strategy, we're not very confident in it, we kind of have these checks. We keep finding this when we use different modeling strategies. And even when we use kind of the most accepted, most rigorous statistical methods, we still find these results. And it's possible too that, even though there's the confidence interval, so some of these large estimates may be somewhat smaller, but within the confidence interval, it's possible for suicide that some of these laws limiting access to guns have a pretty large effect. Suicides make up the majority of gun-related deaths, and these laws make it a little more time-consuming to get a gun, meaning that people who might impulsively go to buy a gun with intentions of self-harm might be stopped from doing that.
Great, thank you, Alex. There's another question in the chat that is one for Alex. Are bullets used by ghost guns traceable?
That's a really interesting question that I actually think is kind of a broader one. So ghost guns are, they use the same ammunition as traditionally manufactured guns. So somebody who has two largely identical guns, but they made one themselves and they purchased the other one, they can probably use the same ammunition. Now, in general, ammunition is not going to be particularly traceable, at least not in the way that a gun is with a serial number. At times, you can tell what kind of gun ammunition came from, but not any more details. Although there are efforts to try to get microstamping to be accepted, which is a technique where something is kind of on the inside the firing pin, I think, of the gun, and it basically imprints all the information that would be on a gun, so the serial number, all sorts of stuff, on the ammunition. So when it's fired, the bullet actually has this information imprinted, and it can be traced back to that specific gun. But there's nothing specific to ghost guns when it comes to ammunition or tracing ammunition.
Thank you, Alex. I want to remind our audience that you can put your questions in the chat, and they don't have to be just on the topics that we've covered thus far. We have a lot of expertise in the room, so to speak, here now that we want to tap and share with you. So there's a follow-up question. I'm going to direct this one to Alex as well. Alex, you're very popular here because the reason this relates to the most recent study that we've published. You're the first author looking at the effect of licensing, purchaser licensing, specifically on Connecticut. And the question is, yes, we're seeing reductions in firearm suicides, but what about the overall suicide rate? Did that decline in Connecticut as well? Important question.
Yeah, that's such a great question, and something we thought a lot about when we were designing the study, because we wanted to make sure that what we were seeing was actually an effect on firearms and access to firearms. So one thing we did was we looked at the whether this same policy affected non-firearm suicide. And we saw basically no change, no effect on non-firearm suicide. So this reduction was really specifically focused on firearm suicide. And an important thing to keep in mind, too, is that that's generally going to be true. Things that affect firearm suicide will affect suicide as a whole, because firearms are such a large part of suicide. Most firearms are used in a huge share of suicides and are the most lethal form of suicide attempt.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Question for Cass. What role do gun safes and other similar storage items play in preventing gun injury, and have any policy proposals address these items?
Yeah, it's such a great question and a timely topic. We hear a lot about the right to gun ownership and sort of the Second Amendment right to own guns, but we don't hear enough about the responsibility that comes along with those rights. And safe and secure gun storage is an important responsibility to ensure that people who are unauthorized or unsupervised aren't gaining access to firearms in the home. And it can also prevent or reduce the likelihood of theft, which is an important source of guns into the underground market. So when we think about injury prevention, we want to think about sort of harm reduction, the way we would with other public health topics. And for a lot of folks, telling them not to have guns in the home is not going to resonate. So thinking about a range of safe storage strategies that you can communicate with folks is really important. Child access prevention laws are a particular policy that many states have, not all, but many states, that require gun owners to store their guns in a way that they cannot be accessed by children and teens under a certain age. And when there are penalties associated with not properly storing your firearms, those do seem to have important benefits, particularly for youth firearm suicide.
So let me just follow up a little more on that, Cass, because again, I think this is really important and timely, as you said. Some states have laws that require, if you're going to purchase a gun, that you get a locking device with it. Do we know anything about those laws? And what about new policy ideas as they relate to perhaps more substantial storage practices like safes or things of that nature? What's your thoughts on that?
There are a handful of states, Maryland being one, for example, where when you purchase any new handgun, you are required to also have some kind of external device. So any handgun you buy in Maryland, for example, comes with a cable lock. And there's also rules that you have to have an internal locking device, like a barrel lock. Um, the I don't know that we have great research demonstrating sort of the effectiveness of that particular policy piece in contrast to sort of safe storage more broadly. But I think one of the important policy routes that folks have not perhaps thought enough about is sort of two things. One, incentivizing through tax incentives, for example, the acquisition of safe storage devices. So we use tax incentives to encourage people to do lots of things: buy energy efficient appliances, put solar panels on your car, all these things. And if we really are taking an approach of harm reduction in reducing gun violence, we should take a page out of some of those books and see how we can incentivize the behaviors we want to see. And on the other hand, I think really focusing on holding individuals accountable when their guns are used by someone who shouldn't have had them. I feel like for a long time, we have not necessarily taken seriously sort of either a direct straw purchase where someone's buying a gun and diverting it to someone else, or just negligent practices that allow people to gain access to firearms. The Oxford, Michigan shooting is sort of a extremely egregious case, but there have been other cases as well. Other school shootings, for example, where teens have gotten guns from home and taken them into school and harmed others. So I think we really need to take seriously when individuals are using guns that they could not lawfully buy on their own, figuring out where they came from and holding those people accountable.
Excellent points. Thank you, Cass. Another question is there research being done on non-fatal firearm injuries? And I think I'll take that one since I'm actually leading a study that's in its early stages. There are two studies that I'm aware of funded by the National Collaborative for Gun Violence Research. This is funded from private foundations, a really growing important part of programs and resources to study gun violence and what we do about it. We're in the study that we are leading here at Hopkins, we are examining really important flaw in the data that the FBI has been collecting for many, many decades from local law enforcement agencies. We have broad categories of non-fatal crimes with guns like aggravated assaults and robberies. But for the most part, we have no information about which in this broad category actually were people shot, because in most instances of assaults and robberies with firearms, no one is actually wounded. Someone is either threatened or shot at, but not wounded. And there's good reason to believe that this is not a totally random phenomenon, how these data get reported. I'll also just say briefly that one thought by many, including in the research community, is that, so what if we don't track the non-fatals? I'm sure they track what fatalities look like. And the truth of the matter is, at least in Baltimore, where I've been studying trends in gun violence, both fatal and non-fatal, for over 2 decades now, those two indicators don't always line up, and they don't always respond in the same way to different prevention efforts. So I do think it's really critically important that we get better data, that is a priority at a governmental level to make sure that we get good administrative data, and secondly, from a research, that we better understand this. Some more questions are coming in, so let me just look at that real quickly. How specifically can community intervention programs support policy implementation? I'm not sure exactly how to interpret that, but let me get to Eric here for a minute. And I think one critically important question, I think on the minds of a lot of people at the local level when they think about community violence intervention is, how does or doesn't this intersect with law enforcement work? Okay. Obviously, in every single city, there's law enforcement. There's somebody on the law enforcement side addressing the problem of gun violence. How do the community violence interventions programs, ideally, like if this is an ideal sense and you're advising Baltimore or St. Louis or Houston, what does that look like? What kind of relationships would be ideal so that we have the most effective solutions?
Yeah, so a lot of questions, your question and also the question in the chat. Let me try to tackle the question in the chat. One, I think we have to educate people so that they're aware of what interventions actually exist, and how they can be implemented and what the results have looked like in other places. So making people aware that there are alternatives and options to traditional policing is critical for getting towards my second point, which is mobilizing constituents. So really mobilizing the residents in a community to engage their local electeds, their local politicians around these types of interventions that people are seeking to be implemented. And some of the best activists and advocates that we have in New York City, very loud, strong, brilliant individuals, are people that have lost loved ones to gun violence, and they've may have lost children to gun violence and so forth, or they live in communities that see high rates of gun violence. Those are some of the best people to galvanize, form coalitions with, and then really go after holding elected officials accountable for making or putting forth legislation that can go into policy that actually supports the types of interventions we're looking at. In terms of Daniel's specific question, I think good law enforcement embraces community partnership. And I think if you have a law enforcement office or a police office, they would want to work with the community in a way that drives down violent crime. And I think, oftentimes we have very competing and conflicting history of how we arrived in these places, how policing has started, what policing has looked like in America, the harm that policing has caused in community. And you have individuals who are still suffering through and from those harms. So in New York, what I always do is understand that we have common goals, and we don't have to champion each other's positions or philosophical differences. But if we're working towards a common goal, there is a working relationship, and we can get there on parallel tracks because we're focused on the goal. And that's ultimately how I approach policing. I'm very cautious with policing because oftentimes there's two populations that are very accessible to most police departments. The older population, they're the ones that would usually go to meetings and give police almost the leeway to come into community and do some things that may be more harmful for community. And this is where that education process sort of takes place. And I'm also very much protective of community's most vulnerable population, which are our young kids. And a lot of police officers and others feel very comfortable navigating with those two populations. But the real population that's greatly impacted, I shouldn't say real population, but the population that's greatly impacted are young Black men. And that's where the bulk of this work has to happen around what is actual engagement, what is defining safety from the lens of those young people.
Thank you, Eric. That's really thoughtful insights there on really complex problems. So there's a question that I am going to take that says, can you speak to the need and importance of national firearm regulations? And again, sort of the example in the chat was thinking about Chicago and their proximity to other states. I'll just briefly say that undoubtedly, national regulations are going to be more effective than state laws by themselves, because as we see in Chicago and many other cities, obviously guns do travel across state lines. I do feel like it is important to also state that nevertheless, we still in our studies do find sometimes quite large impacts from state laws, and that is because there are cost and risk associated with bringing those guns across state lines. So yes, indeed, we would certainly have a far more effective response to preventing gun violence if we had strong federal legislation. But I don't think that should stop us from also thinking about what can be done at the state level to address this problem. Another question came in relevant to ghost guns, so I'm going to get Alex back here for us to address, I think, an interesting question is whether any states are pursuing legislation that attaches additional or greater criminal penalties if you are arrested in possession of a ghost gun versus some other kind of gun. Is this something that you think legislators should consider?
I think this is a really interesting question, and I think there are a couple ways to think about it. One is that some states have put bans in place related to unserialized pieces of guns. So the key piece of a gun is the frame or receiver. And generally, these kits to make ghost guns are centered on this framer receiver. States have banned the possession of these kits or these pieces if they don't have a serial number. A few states have. And so that would be kind of an additional crime, right? That's a new criminal penalty that's created there. Now, that's very different from saying, if somebody is pulled over when they're driving down the street, based on some suspicion, and they end up being searched and they're found to possess a gun illegally. Should the penalty be greater if that is a ghost gun? And I think that question requires more evidence and research. I think that the danger is trying to address ghost guns as a policy problem by focusing on kind of the demand side, focusing on individuals who may or may not have been seeking a ghost gun but ended up with one. And we don't know what the pathway was, whether they just wanted a gun, whether they specifically wanted an untraceable gun. It seems to me like we need more data and research to understand the pathways. But at least to start, it makes sense to focus on utilizing existing regulatory infrastructure to regulate the supply and manufacture of these guns. But again, we just don't have enough evidence to say for sure.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Good response to a challenging question. So just for a final wrap up, I'm going to go to this question and just sort of get everybody to chime in with a brief response. And the question is this: is there something in progress or in the national discourse that you're feeling optimistic about in reducing gun violence? We've talked about some real challenges that we're facing now. What are the things that you find most promising for addressing this problem? I'm going to start with Cass.
Thanks, Daniel. I think thinking back to one of my earlier comments about sort of the most effective thing that we can do, right? It's not going to be one single thing. And so I've been hopeful, encouraged maybe is a better word, to see the investment that the administration is making in community violence intervention, recognizing that we cannot arrest our way out of this issue. We cannot sort of legislate our way out of this issue on our own. We have to have a complementary and sort of holistic approach to the problem. So hearing evidence-based policy continuing to be part of the conversation, that's great, right? We have a strong evidence base on several policies that can help us address this issue, but recognizing that we need investment in communities that have experienced historic and targeted disinvestment. We need to support the people and the communities that are impacted by violence. And so I'm just really encouraged to see that approach being made by this administration.
So I'm going to be quick and just do a hearty amen to what Cass just said there. I think that is really, really promising and encouraging and really unprecedented. And it's something we in public health, of course, are very much behind, and particularly building up that infrastructure as we discussed earlier. And then the other thing I'll just say is, finally, we're getting investment in gun violence research that is really critical to any solution to advance effective gun violence prevention. Eric, what are you most optimistic about now when you think about gun violence prevention?
I'm very optimistic because lots of cities are launching their versions of offices of neighborhood safety that are community-led, informed, deploying and implementing public health approaches across very vulnerable communities. So I'm very optimistic that, that is a framework that a lot of cities are taking on. And the benefits and results go beyond gun violence. It becomes a reintegration program for a lot of individuals. It also becomes a recidivism reduction program. So it really serves a great purpose across multiple compounding and conflicting just areas of people's lives. So I'm optimistic.
Thanks, Eric. Alex, do you have anything you want to add to these comments? something you're optimistic about.
Sure. I want to echo what all the rest of you have said. I'm excited about each of those. I also am excited by kind of a renewed or new focus on more holistic approaches to reducing gun violence and addressing violence in general, things that don't focus specifically on mechanism or individuals, but on social policies and welfare policies, things like that, that maybe foster a less violent environment.
Wow, thanks. I'm glad you raised that, Alex, because we've sort of confined ourselves a little too narrowly in this discussion. Certainly, from a public health frame, we know that there are many important social policies that, when you address affordable housing issues, when you address basically the environmental challenges in areas with a lot of blight and vacant buildings, when you truly invest in communities and provide more social supports, remarkably consistently you see less violence, and that's certainly really important. There's one other question that popped up in the last couple minutes that we have here that I thought I would try to tackle and see if others have some want to add on to this. But what does it mean when there's more than 5,000 background checks that are not done? I guess 5,000 background checks per year that are not done within the 3 days requirement under federal law. That, just to be clear so everybody understands what we're talking about, if you go into a gun shop and put in your application to purchase a gun, if the background check doesn't come back from the FBI or law enforcement within 72 hours, they can go ahead and make that sale. And of course, we've had some incidents in which that has led to great fatal tragedies. So what does that mean? Is that an administrative failure, or is it explainable another way? I will say that it represents an overburdened agency at the rate at which gun sales have been increasing. But I also think it says something about both the quality and completeness of the record system. But honestly, what it really should tell us is we should put public safety ahead of fast commerce. When you're talking about putting a lethal weapon into someone's hands, let's wait and give the time needed to confirm that that person can legally acquire the gun. I don't know if Cass, you want to add anything more to that? Okay. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. I really enjoyed our conversation. I'll just sort of say in parting that if anyone in our audience has further questions, you can certainly reach us, and we'll be happy to respond to your questions. My email is dwebster@jhu.edu. We're easy to find. Reach out to us. We want to be a resource to you to address this really important challenge.